I want you to imagine this moment with me. It's quiet in the house, the kind of stillness that feels almost heavy. The air smells faintly of old leather and polished wood, the remnants of a life that just ended. My father had passed away earlier that week. The funeral was over, the relatives had gone, and yet, I was sitting there, holding a letter he had left behind, the kind of letter that changes everything. In his handwriting, firm, deliberate, he had left me a note. I've taken care of you. $20 million. No one else knows. Protect it. I read it once. I read it twice. My pulse started to race, not because of the money, but because of the storm I knew was coming. My stepmother, she didn't know, and she would be the first to notice if anything seemed off. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk, her questions, relentless. I could feel her presence behind the calm walls of this house, even though she was miles away, at that moment. Here's what that moment teaches us. Life sometimes hands you opportunity wrapped in tension, wealth, influence, or advantage. These are rarely just gifts, they are tests, and the way you move in that tension defines who you are. I made my first conscious decision in that silence. I would not tell her, not yet. She didn't know it yet, but that secret would become a weapon, and a responsibility. A single action flipped the entire outcome, though I couldn't see it clearly in that quiet house. And that's when the first ripple hit. The lawyer called. "We need to discuss your father's estate," he said. His tone was neutral, almost mechanical, but I knew better. In this room, in this moment, the rules had shifted. I had inherited not just wealth, but a web of expectation, suspicion, and strategy I hadn't trained for. You see, it's easy to say, "I'd handle it." It's another thing entirely to sit there, heart pounding, knowing a single misstep could unravel everything your father built, and maybe even your life as you know it. I want you to sit with that tension for a moment. Imagine it. The quiet, the letters, the looming confrontation. The story we're about to unfold isn't just about inheritance. It's about human nature, power, strategy, and the invisible systems that test us when no one is watching. And here's the kicker. In the very next scene, everything changes. The world outside the walls, the people who think they understand you, start moving pieces you didn't even know existed. And that is when the real story begins. To understand why that $20 million carried more weight than money ever could, we need to step back to a time when my father's influence was both a blessing and a burden. I grew up in a house that seemed ordinary from the outside. Manicured lawns, Sunday dinners, polite smiles, but inside the air always carried tension. My father was a man of vision, yes, but also a man of exacting standards. Every move, every choice, every word was measured against a code he expected us to live by, a code I didn't fully understand until much later. And then there was my stepmother. She was clever, ambitious, and relentless. A force disguised as refinement. From the day she entered our lives, I understood that her goals were not aligned with mine. She saw the world in leverage and opportunity, always calculating her advantage. Most children wouldn't notice such subtle games, but I did. Here's what that moment teaches us. Life doesn't just hand you challenges, they're layered. There's the visible struggle, yes, but underneath there are hidden currents, biases, expectations, inherited pressures. These currents shape who we are, who we become, and sometimes who we survive to be. I learned early that survival in this environment required more than obedience. It required observation, patience, and quiet strategy. I remember the first time I noticed the subtle manipulation, a small comment from my stepmother, delivered with a smile, that could sway my father's decisions if I reacted the wrong way. She didn't even raise her voice. She didn't have to. And yet, I knew I had to understand the game. The world outside also wasn't simple. Growing up black in spaces dominated by wealth, expectation, and power introduced its own pressures. Microaggressions, dismissals, and systemic bias weren't just academic concepts, they were daily reality. I learned early to read people, to sense intentions, and to anticipate moves before they were made. That skill, unnoticed by most, would later become a lifeline. So, when my father died, leaving me that letter, I was not an untested child. I was someone who had been trained quietly, painfully, in the arts of patience, observation, and strategic discretion. But here's the twist. Experience alone does not resolve moral dilemmas. Just because I could navigate power dynamics, didn't mean I was ready for the ethical weight of what lay ahead. She didn't know it yet, but I had the intelligence to outmaneuver her. But the choice wasn't about winning, it was about how to win without losing myself. A single misstep could destroy trust, fracture family, or expose secrets that had been protected for decades. And that's the root cause of every conflict that followed. Opportunity colliding with moral ambiguity. My father's death didn't just leave me $20 million. It left a test of character, one where patience, strategy, and ethical clarity would define whether I merely survived or truly transformed the system around me. By the time the first confrontation arrived, The one that would put me on a moral and strategic fork in the road. I already had the tools. I just didn't know which path to take. And that is where the story pivots. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as the sunlight was cutting through the blinds in thin golden lines. My stepmother was on the line, cheerful, masking the curiosity I could hear in her voice. She didn't know it yet, but the letter in my hands, my father's final instruction, was a secret she would kill to uncover. Here's what that moment teaches us. The universe doesn't just test your skills, it tests your morality, and often those two collide at the most inconvenient times. She asked questions about my father's estate, about assets, and about plans. Small harmless questions on the surface, but beneath them, like a surgeon's scalpel, she was probing for weakness, for any hint that could tip the balance in her favor. My instinct screamed to deflect, to mislead, to protect what I had been entrusted with. Yet another part of me hesitated. Could I really withhold the truth from someone who had been technically a family member? A single action flipped the entire outcome, and that action was my choice. Speak and risk exposure, or remain silent and risk being accused of betrayal. I remember the internal debate, clearly. I could almost see it, physically, two paths laid out before me, both illuminated, both dangerous. On one path, honesty could have mollified her curiosity, but it would have placed me directly in her line of leverage. On the other path, discretion would protect the inheritance, and my father's intent, but it carried the weight of deception. She didn't know it yet, but I had been preparing for this moment my entire life. Every subtle observation, every micro-expression I'd learned to read, every lesson in patience and restraint, all of it culminated here. I had the intelligence and the foresight. What I lacked was certainty. And then it happened. The split-second decision that defined everything. I chose silence, not from fear, but from strategy, not from malice, but from principle. Protecting my father's intention was more than financial, it was ethical. It was about honoring his legacy, and ensuring that the power he left behind didn't fall into hands that could misuse it. That choice was exhilarating, and terrifying. In the quiet, after the call, I felt a strange mix of triumph and vulnerability. Every moment after that could unravel in unexpected ways. Every misstep, every assumption, could lead to exposure, or worse, personal and relational ruin. And that is the heart of the moral fork, the tension between immediate safety and long-term integrity, between the visible path and the invisible one. Most people never pause to see it. Most people choose the path of least resistance. I chose the one that demanded patience, cunning, and moral clarity. But as with every pivotal choice, the world responded immediately. Subtle signals, small slips, and unseen observers began to test the walls I was building. And that is when the hidden power, my unseen advantage, started to reveal itself. In the days following my father's funeral, the house became a chessboard. Every conversation, every casual glance, every question from my stepmother was a move, and I, for the first time, felt the weight and the thrill of true strategic control. Here's what that moment teaches us. Sometimes power is not about loud displays, public victories, or dramatic confrontations. Real power is subtle, patient, and often invisible, until it strikes. I began to observe not just her words, but her patterns. The way she paused before making assumptions, the way she nudged others toward conclusions, the silent confidence she exuded. Most would see only charm. I saw leverage, vulnerabilities, and predictable behaviors. A single, seemingly small action flipped the dynamic. I subtly shifted the narrative about my father's intentions in casual conversation. I never lied outright. I simply reframed details, guided assumptions, and let her reveal what she already believed to be true about my knowledge. She didn't know it yet, but I was reading her moves like a map, understanding the terrain she had built for herself. Beyond that, I drew on lessons I hadn't realized I'd internalized. Negotiation tactics from early family conflicts, principles of behavioral psychology I had studied in school, and insights from mentors who had quietly taught me how to influence without coercion. The combination was subtle but powerful. I was no longer reacting, I was initiating. Here's the insight most people miss. Intelligence is not just what you know, but how you deploy it in moments of uncertainty. I had inherited more than wealth. I had inherited knowledge, intuition, and resilience, and in these quiet days, those tools began to awaken fully. But with every subtle victory, came the pressure of exposure. I could sense the tension building, as if the walls themselves were leaning in, whispering that control was fragile. That's the nature of hidden power. It is never secure, never visible to the untrained eye, and always at risk of being discovered by those who underestimate patience and discipline. And then came the first real test, a legal notice, an unexpected demand, a public assertion that threatened to undo the careful equilibrium I had begun to construct. For a moment it seemed as if all the quiet mastery in the world couldn't hold back the storm. But that, my friends, was exactly when the system would push back, and the moment that would set the stage for the protagonist's most profound growth. The breaking point was near, and the world was about to expose its teeth. The calm I had built began to crack like thin ice under pressure. The lawyer, meticulous and detached, informed me that my stepmother had begun probing the estate through indirect channels. Questions were coming from banks, investment advisors, even family friends, each one designed to expose the gaps in my knowledge, to create panic, to bait me into a mistake. Here's what that moment teaches us. The world rarely attacks where you expect. It tests not only skill, but emotional resilience. The true challenge is enduring the storm, while remaining unseen, unfazed, and strategically present. I remember the exact moment it all seemed to collapse. A public rumor leaked, small, seemingly innocuous, but it painted me as unprepared, inexperienced, perhaps even dishonest. Social circles whispered, and a distant cousin sent a pointed message questioning my father's intentions. It was humiliation, a public breakdown in a world that values perception as much as reality. I sat in my father's study, staring at the framed photos on the wall, feeling the weight of every expectation, every system stacked against me. And I realized, no matter how prepared you think you are, systems are designed to overwhelm, to test your resolve, to make you falter when the stakes are highest. But here's the quiet truth. Breaking points are also birthplaces. In that moment when everything felt like it was crumbling, I discovered the first glimpse of my own resilience. I realized that the stakes were never just about money or inheritance. They were about character, vision, and the ability to navigate morally complex systems without losing integrity. She didn't know it yet, but I was far from defeated. Every public humiliation, every subtle attack, every pressure point, it was training. It was a mirror reflecting exactly where I needed to act next. I could feel the shift internally, a mental tightening, a clarity sharpening around one central truth. My next move would not be reactive. It would be deliberate, strategic, unseen until executed. And that's where the story pivots. Every great comeback begins not when things are easy, but precisely at the point when the world tells you, you cannot succeed. That pressure, that crisis, became the crucible that would forge the transformation, and the spark for the new plan that would turn the tide. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't in the form of a grand revelation or a dramatic confrontation. It was in a conversation with someone I trusted implicitly, a mentor who had guided me through earlier trials without ever taking the spotlight. Sometimes, they said, the problem isn't the opposition. The problem is how you perceive the battlefield. You spin playing a defensive game. Now it's time to think like the architect. Here's what that moment teaches us. Transformation often comes not from action alone, but from a shift in perspective. The moment you see the system not as a threat, but as a landscape to navigate strategically, the rules change. I realized then that my silence was both a strength and a limitation. Protecting the inheritance had kept me safe, but it had not created leverage. I needed a plan that went beyond defense. A plan that would allow me to move unseen, outmaneuver threats, and assert control, without revealing the hand I held. I began to map it all out. In quiet hours of reflection, each stakeholder, each player, each potential risk became a node on a mental grid. I identified the levers of influence, the unseen pathways, and the psychological patterns that would allow me to anticipate moves before they happened. Every tiny observation from earlier days became a tactical advantage. A single insight shifted everything. The system that seemed designed to crush me could actually be redirected. The pressure, the scrutiny, the hidden agendas, they weren't obstacles. They were guides. Every subtle attack from my stepmother, or the extended family highlighted exactly where influence lay, and how I could wield it without exposing my intentions. She didn't know it yet, but the tide was about to turn. My approach would no longer be reactionary. It would be proactive, quiet and precise. I was no longer just defending a fortune. I was orchestrating outcomes, building alliances, and shaping perception in ways that would seem effortless to outsiders. By the end of that turning point, I had a new mantra: patience plus precision equals power. Every decision, every word, every move, would be measured against this principle. I felt a calm clarity I had never experienced before, as if every previous failure, every moment of doubt, had been preparing me for this strategic awakening. And as all good plans do, the first moves of the new strategy began in silence. No fanfare, no immediate applause, just calculated, deliberate steps toward a quiet but inevitable reversal. Execution began quietly. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic confrontations. Every action was calculated, every word intentional. I started to shift conversations, to plant ideas subtly, to guide assumptions without ever exposing my hand. Here's what that moment teaches us. Mastery often looks like patience. Real power is rarely visible in the beginning. It accumulates quietly, in the small decisions, the unnoticed victories, and the disciplined restraint of immediate gratification. I started by reinforcing key alliances. People who had influence over the estate but were neutral. A compliment here, a gentle correction there, subtle gestures that signaled competence and reliability. Each interaction built credibility. Each conversation shaped perception. Every micro-action was a silent chess move. Meanwhile, my stepmother grew restless. She was aggressive, trying to force the hand I was carefully hiding. She didn't know it yet, but her impatience was my advantage. Every hasty move she made revealed her patterns, her vulnerabilities, her blind spots. I began cataloging them, like data points in a strategy map, anticipating the next push. I also took steps to secure my own emotional and mental edge. Meditation, reflection, and deliberate focus sharpened my instincts. This wasn't just about money. It was about maintaining control over fear, ego, and reactive impulses. Each quiet victory reinforced my confidence, showing me that strategic patience could withstand public pressure. Then came the first reversal. A subtle, almost invisible win, a minor legal hurdle, which could have blocked my control, was diffused not through confrontation, but through insight. I had anticipated the objection before it happened, addressed it preemptively, and secured the outcome silently. No one noticed at the time, but that single action flipped the power dynamic in my favor. A single principle drove every move. The visible world only reacts to the story you allow it to see. Behind the scenes, I was shaping the narrative, controlling the flow, and preparing for the moment when the public reversal would arrive. And that moment, when the tables finally turn, was approaching. It would not be dramatic in a conventional sense. Instead, it would be devastatingly precise, morally undeniable, and strategically complete. Every silent step had led to this climactic shift. The moment arrived like a slow crescendo, almost imperceptible at first. A meeting with the estate's key stakeholders, the people who had once questioned my competence, who had doubted my judgment, was scheduled. Everyone assumed it would be routine, perhaps even favorable to my stepmother, whose overconfidence had grown with every minor victory. She didn't know it yet, but the stage was set for her miscalculation. Here's what that moment teaches us. True mastery often hides in plain sight. The world sees only the tip of the iceberg. The depth beneath determines the outcome. As I spoke, I calmly outlined the estate's structure, subtly revealing decisions, contingencies, and allocations that had been invisible until now. Each word, each reference, each carefully timed pause, demonstrated competence, without arrogance. The room shifted. People leaned in, attentive. I could feel the balance tipping. Then came the revelation, the $20 million my father had left me, not announced with drama, not wielded as a weapon, but framed strategically. I revealed it in a way that highlighted intention, stewardship, and moral responsibility. Stakeholders could see clearly that the inheritance was protected, accounted for, and aligned with my father's principles. The impact was immediate. My stepmother's confident posture faltered, the subtle cracks of her impatience now visible to all. Those who had doubted me now questioned her motives. Every carefully planted observation, every silent move I had made, converged into one undeniable truth. I had outmaneuvered her without confrontation, without compromise to integrity. She didn't know it yet, but the system that once seemed poised to overwhelm me had been reshaped. The power dynamic had flipped. My actions were not just personal victories. They were public, morally grounded, and strategically indisputable. And here's the insight most people miss. Reversal is not about vengeance. It is about aligning intelligence, patience, and ethics. The public outcome wasn't just about winning. It was about transforming the perception of fairness, competence, and trust within the system itself. For a brief moment the room was still. A single action, a quiet, deliberate, ethical maneuver had rewritten expectations, and the lesson for us all is clear. True power often comes not from force, but from foresight, patience, and the courage to act when the moment is right. But even victories have consequences. As the dust settled, the aftermath began to reveal itself, not just for my stepmother, but for everyone touched by the estate, the decisions, and the ripple of influence I had set in motion. The room emptied slowly, leaving behind a quiet tension, the kind that lingers after the storm has passed. My stepmother left first, her confidence visibly diminished, her attempts at control quietly undone. She didn't lash out, she didn't protest openly. She simply realized that the game she had been playing so aggressively had met a player who understood both the rules and the consequences better. Here's what that moment teaches us. Victory is often silent, subtle, and morally nuanced. True power doesn't require domination. It requires clarity, preparation, and the courage to act with integrity when the moment calls for it. The ripple effects were immediate but measured. Stakeholders expressed renewed trust, not just in me, but in the principles my father had championed. Relationships that had seemed fragile, strengthened. The inheritance, once a potential point of contention, became a symbol of stewardship, foresight, and accountability. I took a moment to reflect privately. In that quiet, I realized that the lessons went far beyond money or control. I had learned the value of patience, the power of observation, and the ethical responsibility that comes with opportunity. I had turned tension into strategy, uncertainty into clarity, and risk into transformation. But redemption was not just mine. My stepmother, in her retreat, had the opportunity to recalibrate, to learn that influence is not simply about aggression, it's about respect for intelligence, insight, and ethical boundaries. Even those who had doubted me were reminded that competence paired with integrity leaves a mark far stronger than temporary advantage or intimidation. Here's the deeper insight. Every crisis carries within it a lesson about character, about foresight, and about the systemic forces that shape our lives. The aftermath of triumph is rarely just celebration. It is reflection, humility, and the conscious choice to steward the results responsibly. And as I closed the door on that chapter, I understood something fundamental. The real inheritance wasn't $20 million. It was the knowledge that one can navigate complex systems, confront moral dilemmas, and emerge not only victorious, but ethically empowered. Even as life continued around me, the quiet clarity of that moment, earned through patience, strategy, and moral courage, became a blueprint, a guide not just for future battles, but for life itself. The stage was now set for the final lesson, the lasting legacy, and the call to action for anyone willing to watch, listen, and grow from this journey. The house is quiet now, but the echoes of that story remain. I sit back, reflecting not on the wealth I inherited, but on the lessons etched into every decision, every pause, every calculated move. Here's what that moment teaches us. Legacy isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in wisdom, integrity, and the way we navigate challenges that test both our skills and our morality. The $20 million was a catalyst, yes, but the real inheritance was the clarity I gained in strategy, patience, and ethical action. My stepmother's retreat, the quiet respect earned from stakeholders, and even the subtle admiration from observers, these were secondary outcomes. The primary victory was internal. I had proven first to myself and then to the world that intelligence, discretion, and moral courage can create outcomes that are both effective and honorable. For anyone watching, here's the ultimate takeaway. Life will place you at moral forks, present systemic obstacles, and challenge your perception of control. What defines you is not how loudly you respond, but how wisely, patiently, and ethically you act. Your power lies in foresight, in understanding human nature, and in executing strategies quietly, with clarity and integrity. She didn't know it yet, but the silent victories, the careful observations, and the ethical choices had rewritten the narrative of power itself. And that is the kind of mastery worth aspiring to, not just for money, but for life, legacy, and transformation. Now, consider your own life. Where are the moments that require patience? The decisions that demand strategy and moral clarity? What legacy do you wish to leave behind? If this story resonated with your values, remember to take one actionable insight: observe, reflect, and act with integrity. These principles don't just shape outcomes, they shape you. And if this journey inspired you, like, comment, and subscribe to continue exploring stories that challenge, teach, and empower. Every story is an opportunity to grow, and every insight is a step toward mastery. Because at the end of the day, true power isn't about wealth or status, it's about navigating life's complexity with intelligence, ethics, and quiet resilience.